The era that we're going to be looking at right here, from the end of the War of 1812 in 1815 through the election of 1824, is generally known as the era of good feeling, or the era of good feelings, question mark, as we're going to try to figure out, is the country really coming together or is the country coming apart? So it's really this nationalism and sectionalism both happening at the same time. When we think of the people that are promoting nationalism, these are the people that are thinking of this nation writ large, where they're seeing all parts of the country sort of interdependent and working together, really in the spirit of coming out of this tie win over the British. Now, then at the same time, you have your sectionalists, and these are people that are looking at their specific region, be it the Northeast, people who've always been shipping, who've got sort of manufacturing in quotes because we're really not there yet. Is it the slave-based agriculture of the South? Is it the people that are concerned about farming in the Midwest, as well as being concerned with getting transportation out there so they can have people and goods go back and forth between the West and the Northeast? But when we look at this post-war nationalism, we want to consider how Madison had become refederalized. We talked about this at the end of the War of 1812, where perspectives had been changed, where Madison had looked at the problems during the war and said, boy, without that Bank of the United States, whose charter had run out in 1811, and without a standing army going into war, we really struggled. So all of a sudden, Madison, remember, who'd been a Federalist, wrote the Federalist Papers, and then became a Democratic Republican right-hand man to Jefferson, is now going to switch, and he's going to support a larger army and a navy, a national bank, and a tariff. So in many ways, he becomes the Hamilton guy that he was before he became a Jefferson guy. Now, of course, the Bank of the United States had been incredibly controversial back in the 1790s. As Jefferson said, you can't have it. If anybody can have it, it's a state institution. And Hamilton had said it's necessary and proper, and Washington and Congress had agreed with him. But what happened in 1811 when that 20-year charter went out is that states began chartering new local banks, and they weren't regulated, and they started printing paper money all over the place. This paper money had different values depending where you are. There's real economic instability with no standardized currency. So Madison is going to back a second Bank of the United States to support a stable national currency and would promote this economic growth coming out of the war. BOTUS was, in fact, rechartered for another 20 years, so we got to keep that in mind. It's rechartered in 1816, it's going to come up in 1836, and then in 1832, 4 years early, it's going to become a controversy again. And BOTUS, like the first BOTUS, the second one, is in Philadelphia. It's got branches in every state. But Westerners are opposed to the bank because they saw it as an elite East Coast institution, much as Jefferson had claimed way back in the 1790s. And then we're going to see after the Panic of 1819 that there's really some concerns about what the bank is doing that sort of reinforce this fear and paranoia of people in the West of this evil monster in Philadelphia. Just as the bank was an issue that had been in the 1790s and now appears post-war of 1812, a tariff is going to come up as well. Now, of course, we remember that there was a tariff way back, Fat White Bus Man. But what we're going to see here is a truly protective tariff, not just for generating revenue, but to try to protect infant American industries. Now, we know because of the Embargo Act in 1807, the War of 1812 from 1812 to early 1815, the United States didn't have British goods, so it really jump-started manufacturing. I don't want us to think that there's like an industrialization that's going on. That certainly is not happening till the end of another war, the Civil War, but we're really starting to get much more in terms of America making its own goods, which is ironic because remember, Jefferson was anti-manufacturing, and because of his Embargo Act, he actually started manufacturing. But sort of as a big FU from Great Britain post-war of 1812, they started to dump cheap goods into the country to try to undercut American competitors. Basically like, hey, we might have lost this war, but we can still win in economic warfare. Northern manufacturers turn to Congress and they say, we need our industries protected. And I've talked to you about how basically tariffs make American goods more attractive. And the tariff of 1816 is truly the first protective tariff. And it's pretty significant, 20 to 25% tax on imported goods. Now, of course, this benefits the Northeast, who makes these goods much more than the South, because remember, the South doesn't make its own goods, and as a result, is going to have to buy, more expensive lesser quality American goods as opposed to the British, and plus, oftentimes the other countries will raise their tariffs on American goods, and at this point, really, the only American goods that are going to Europe would be agriculture anyway, so it really hurts the Southerners. And again, another element that we saw under Hamilton, one that never actually came to fruition, was his belief in internal improvements. Remember, he had asked Congress for roads and bridges and canals and harbors, basically saying we need to be able to move people and goods around if we're going to have a commercial economy. Congress said no in the 1790s. Now this comes up again, okay? Particularly when we looked at the War of 1812 and people weren't able to move very well, particularly troops around the country. So the West is the one that wants the internal improvements because there's not rivers that really go east to west. Most major rivers in the United States go north to south. And so those thoroughfares are there, but there's no arteries going from the East Coast out to the West. The Northeast looked at these and said, we don't want internal improvements because they would effectively drain people out of the Northeast. And again, if you lose population, you lose political power. John Marshall, we remember, had come in as part of the Midnight Judges. We, of course, remember him in 1803 for Marlborough versus Madison. We remember him in 1804 for basically swallowing up Alexander Hamilton's ghost when Hamilton is killed by Burr. And he's got three major cases that really reinforce this Federalist ideology when, in fact, the Federalists are all but dead and gone. In one case, unfortunately, involving Dartmouth, called Dartmouth versus Woodward, what happens is that the New Jersey state legislature tries to change Dartmouth's college charter. Now, that charter actually had come when they were colonists, so it actually predates the United States. The goal of New Hampshire changing the charter is they actually want to have more control over this particular college. Now, John Marshall looks at it and he says, you know what, that original charter was like a contract, and states can't change a contract. Now, a contract is really the foundation for business. That's what you enter into to make a business work. Now, this is particularly Federalist because what it says is, states, you don't have the power to change a charter, even though oftentimes states are the ones who grant a charter in the first place. So really, it's both a slap at state power and at the emphasis on how important a charter is. Again, John Marshall, anti-state, pro-federal government, and pro-business. Now, in the case of McCulloch versus Maryland, Tyndall doesn't do a great job, I'll be honest, in explaining what happened. But what the key part is that you have a state bank in Maryland that tries to tax a branch of Botus. Now, Botus had branches in all the states. And Marshall looked at this, and he famously said, first of all, okay, I'm going to rule once and for all that the bank is constitutional. And that's important, again, because there's always lingering questions going all the way back to the 1790s about where in the Constitution gives the power. And he says, again, it's the necessary and proper clause. But he says that a state institution cannot tax a federal institution. Because in this case, if it taxed that federal institution, it could keep taxing it and keep taxing it and keep taxing it and effectively tax it to death. So he famously said, the power to tax is the power to destroy. And what he was really saying in that moment was an emphasis on the supremacy clause, that the Constitution makes the federal government supreme over the states, so that a state bank couldn't really attack a federal institution. So famously, the power to tax is the power to destroy, which is the supremacy of the federal government, as well as ruling once and for all that Botus is constitutional. Now, the last of this sort of trio of Federalist cases is called Gibbons versus Ogden. And it has to do with a monopoly that is granted to a steamboat, okay? And then there's another license that's given to a different steamboat company. But at the end of the day, what you need to understand is these steamboats traveled in areas between New Jersey and New York, not simply within. So instead of looking at intra, which is within state commerce, they're looking at intrastate commerce. And he rules, again, looking back at the Commerce Clause in the Constitution and says the federal government has the power over interstate commerce. So again, a trio of cases that all either emphasize the power of the federal government over the states or really the importance of business. Now we're going to bring in a guy named Henry Clay, and it's important to understand Henry Clay because he's up there with Benjamin Franklin and Alexander Hamilton as people who never actually were president but had a tremendous influence on the United States. Unlike Franklin and Hamilton, he does run for president 3 times and loses every time. But his emphasis is, again, a Hamiltonian emphasis, and I call it BTN. It's in some ways the sort of new version of Fat White Bus Man. The B is BOTUS, the T is tariffs, and the N is a network of internal improvements. It also stands for the Big Ten Network for any sports fans out there. And so Henry Clay is going to fight again for a higher tariff. So I already mentioned that there's a higher tariff, and now I'm going to explain sort of the process behind it. So again, his emphasis is, we need to block the sale of British goods, and he's got to try to sell it. He's got to try to sell it to an audience that is not necessarily that amenable to it. So he says to the West, listen, I know you don't like tariffs per se, but how about if this tariff could be used to fund the internal improvements that you want? And so that was actually, made it more attractive to them. In terms of BOTUS, which of course is part of his plan, you've got these, Westerners and Southerners who look at an institution and they say, we've been suspicious and paranoid about this from the beginning. We think that this is an elite East Coast institution centered in Philadelphia, and we are always going to be at the mercy of those powers in the Northeast. Now, they have reason to believe that this is true once you have the Panic of 1819. And we're going to have panics throughout the 1800s. And they actually follow a pretty interesting order, 9-7-7-3-3. So 1819, 1837, 1857, 1873, 1893. And they all have to do usually with something called overspeculation. So post-war of 1812, you've got this European demand for American products. Not products that are being made here, products that are really being grown. So like cotton, tobacco, and flour. And people are going to plant more and more and more. Again, people are going to want more and more land. And they got to buy more and more land. And they've got state banks that are unregulated, that are giving risky loans. Even the federal government is actually making some pretty unwise land sales. And then what you have is you have a bunch of people who tried to buy low and they want to sell high. So they're speculating in land. At the same time, you've got good weather in Europe that gives them good crops. So there's not as much of a need for American crops. So what you have is you've got British textile mills like we had in Lowell, Massachusetts. They don't need our cotton anymore. They're cheaper cotton they're finding other places. But because it's the United States' #1 export, that causes cotton prices to drop. Remember, when there's not as much of a demand, prices go down. So as a result of the major export going down, business is going to slow. When business is going to slow, people aren't going to have as much money. Banks ultimately start to fail, and unemployment significantly increases. And that's a really important piece that you have to understand, is that when banks can't make loans, obviously business can't get started. And so when you don't have businesses going, then you're going to have high unemployment. Now, what's really important to understand, sort of a chain of events that occurs. So BOTUS looks at the situation. Again, this is new BOTUS. This is the second BOTUS. And you've got an effort to really sort of restore confidence in the banking system. And so they look at state banks and they say, you've made risky loans. You have to have enough hard currency, namely gold coins, in your vaults to make sure that you can cover all the loans you're making. Because if you don't have enough money to pay back the people, then basically your bank is not worth anything. So state banks, in order to get the gold coins, they put pressure on the people who borrowed money from them. And then those people ended up, becoming far more impoverished because they basically had to give all their money back to the bank. So at the end of the day, Westerners particularly feel squeezed by sort of this chain of events that BOTUS had leaned on state banks, who leaned on them. It's going to be one of the reasons that Andrew Jackson is especially critical of BOTUS, and then it's going to come up in 1832, basically after his first 4 years in office, and it's going to become a major issue again. So we've now moved from 1819, Panic of 1819, to 1820, and it's important to realize that at this point, Missouri is ready to apply for statehood. They are the first state coming out of the Louisiana Purchase that has applied for statehood. They want to come in as a slave state. Now, there's some concerns because if you have a slave state that comes in, you want to make sure you have a free state that also comes in to keep that balance in the Senate. Now, in the House, because of the population in the Northeast, it was always sort of more free than slave, but the Senate had tried to keep even. So the compromise is that Maine's going to come in as a slave state, Missouri's going to come in as a slave state. Maine is going to offset it as a free state. But the real sort of interesting part is that the southern boundary of Missouri, which is the 3630 line, will now be the line above which no slavery can exist, except for Missouri. Missouri is the exception. Now, Henry Clay brokered this deal, really sort of keeping the North and the South from coming to blows. And he's going to get this name, the Great Compromiser, and he's going to be involved in two other subsequent compromises. But it's important to realize that a compromise is really nothing more than a band-aid. So we're going to see problems certainly fester as we go forward.